We are living in a computer-programmed reality. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant. And I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.
Hey everybody, Robert Phoenix here. How's it going? What's happening? I'm going to be recording this for YouTube as a video, not a live stream. We're just going to stream audio today. But let me get into my YouTube technology. And officially welcome everybody to both the live stream on Spreaker, which you're hearing now, and also the archive version of the show, which you'll be seeing on YouTube later today, because we know how much people dig those visuals, and I'm rocking kind of a new face, so it'll be interesting to kind of see it played back on YouTube. What's going on out there? How is everyone? Another day. Another intense, powerful, transformational day on planet Earth, Terra, third stone from the sun, the third dimensional matrix playground that we're all trying to sort out and sort through as the blender gets kicked up a couple of notches. I think we've gone from let's see, frappe to pulverize. We're not quite at pulverize yet. We've gone from frappe to crushing ice. That's where we are in the world blender. So I guess we should probably look at the events that are taking place right now and try to wrap our heads around them, and as much as we can, our hearts around them as well. First of all, I'm going to do a little bit of a brief intro for today's show, and then I'm going to play you part one of a recording I did yesterday with Steve and Krys Crimi, and we're looking at the life of John Dee and who John Dee was, and the importance and the role that John Dee has played in the formation of this country, the United States of America, and try to get ultimately beneath the skin of the roots of these United States, who is behind it, and how it makes us, how do I say this, how it informs us at this point in time in the 21st century, being an American, being a citizen of the planet, being a citizen of the cosmos. These are really important questions that we'll endeavor to untangle over the course of the next couple of sessions, couple of episodes with Steve and Krys. And John Dee will be the kind of the portal and the entry into that experience. So I want to play part one today. It's about 37 minutes. It's not a long playing show like we normally have. But the next episode that we'll be doing at the end of August it'll be much more in depth, and we'll get into the roots of Hermeticism, alchemy, magic, who the big players are, where it came from, and how it's been run as a countercultural program for a very long period of time. And we'll hold that up against the Christian/Catholic mirror, and we'll weigh in on that as well, because of course there's orders within both that tend to be more mystically or even occult oriented and driven. So hopefully we'll put together all those pieces so that we can have a better understanding of the esoteric and alchemical roots of the founding of the United States of America. I think that would be a good thing to understand and be able to look at, because there's this whole idea that Trump is making America great again. And so we have to go back into time, right? When was America great, and what did it stand for during those periods where theoretically it was great? Is it America during the late 1800s, the antebellum, reforming itself as a country, moving into the 1900s and the heat and sweat of the Industrial Revolution, when the robber barons rise to power? We have the economic titans like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Mellon and Carnegie and all those characters. Is that a great time? It's an interesting time. A lot of stuff doesn't happen without them. They are a necessary evil in a lot of ways. But was that when America was great? What about after that? What about just before the 1920s and the crash? Was that a great time? And was America great then? And what about afterwards? What about World War I? Did that make us great? What did we get involved with? How did we get involved? Why were we involved? Then there's the Depression. Well, we were certainly great then, because not a lot of countries could have pulled through that. Not a lot of people could have pulled through that. It was a tough time. And I've written about this to a large extent on my website, and that was a period where, as a country, we've been through a number of collective psychic traumas. And really the first was, in kind of a modern sense, was the Civil War. Of course, it represented a schism and a fracture unlike anything we've ever seen until maybe recently. And then after the Civil War, of course, we have the Great Depression, and that's where we're tested as a country, as a whole, not where we're split and fragmented into kind of two ideologies and two geographic zones. And I'd actually say that coming through the Great Depression, that's when America was really great, because people had to get by and have a sense of hope and have a sense of the future. And that was not an easy thing to do. So I don't want to use a totally negative or depressing example, but people are known when things are down, when their character is down, when their life is down, their character is tested. Somebody's trying to call me. I hate it when people try to call me during the show. I should just turn my phone off. Thank you. But the Depression was also a major traumatic piece. And that traumatic piece, even like the Civil War, sends these ripples through generations. And it's really hard to quantify the long-term effect of that kind of trauma that took place. Many of you who listen to this show either had parents who were raised by Depression-era parents, or if you're old enough, your parents actually might have gone through the Depression, although you'd have to be probably approaching, well, you'd be older. You'd probably in your mid-80s. I'm not sure how many mid-80s listeners I have. My mother is 80, and she doesn't even listen to my show. It upsets her. It's okay. I get it. But to understand the Great Depression, it had an impact think of the amount of love or emotion that was on the table for kids getting raised by Depression-era parents. These are the parents that went through the Depression and they had children. And the children would be probably in their late 70s right about now, early 80s. There wasn't a lot of love on the table, right? It just wasn't. And so that ripple effect goes through the next generation. And so what we're looking at from the Depression is this tectonic, this seismic event that really disrupted a huge amount of lives, really from like the first and second chakra, not a lot of love. Everything was built on and based on survival mode. And then as a result, the attendant generations have had to deal with that. Well, that's another significant era of collective trauma that I don't think enough work has been done around, to be honest with you. And then we move into the wars. I already talked about World War I, then there's World War II, then there's the Korean War, and then we move into Vietnam, and it's just trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. And we've been living with this for a very, very long time. And now, every single day, it's Trigger City. So if you have a hard time with the news, you have a hard time with what's being floated out there, then it's probably either one or two courses of action are really what you need to think about. One is completely unplug, and some people are really doing that. And the other is to get through it so that really very little triggers you and very little traumatizes you so that you can stand in the face of the storm. And I'm pretty much in that camp. I've always been in that camp. Again, I'm not perfect. I'm not bulletproof. There's a lot of stuff I'm still working on my mission here, but that's one thing that I've always put my face in the wind on stuff. So let's just break this down and give you a couple examples today on the solar eclipse of things that are taking place. Well, first of all, we have rhetoric with Iran. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, Trump says, don't mess with us or we're going to blow you into the Middle Ages. We're going to make you hurt so hard that you'll never forget the lesson, or something to that effect, right? That's total kind of Trump speak. Apparently, Iran is getting deeply into cryptos. Charles over on Facebook sent me some material which I've not delved into, but they're getting ready. They're like trying to protect their assets and their currency. So Iran is investing in cryptos. Venezuela is about to launch their cryptocurrency, I think, by the end of the year. So these are major developments on kind of a monetary level that countries are beginning to either hedge or fully adopt a cryptocurrency. But we have the Iran rhetoric, and it's heating up. And we know where Trump is getting his talking points from around Iran. And they're coming from Tel Aviv and / now Jerusalem through his pal Bibi Netanyahu and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who I like to call 00666. There are a lot of people who think Jared Kushner is Antichrist material. And I am not adverse to pondering that thought, to be quite honest with you. And apparently, Alex Jones, who's now been banned from YouTube, has been kind of like pushing Jared Kushner as president. Can you imagine that? How would Jared Kushner fare in a debate? Not well. Have you ever heard Jared Kushner talk? He kind of talks like this. He has a very, very kind of very soft, very, this is how he approaches his delivery. He's not very forthright, or he's not very dynamic. There aren't many examples of him talking, but I guarantee you they're kind of like that. So Jared Kushner in a debate scenario would not work. It would not work at all. I'll tell you how Jared Kushner could become president. Are you ready? Jared Kushner could become president by becoming vice president. Does that kind of intrigue you a little bit? If I was Michael Pence, I'd be a little concerned. Because that is one way that Jared Kushner could become president without ever being elected. Think Gerald Ford. That's what happened to Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford became vice president to Richard Nixon because there was a scandal, and a lame scandal with Spiro T. Agnew, some, bullshit corruption thing. Which politician isn't corrupt? You show me a politician that isn't corrupt, and I'll show you a politician that isn't in office. All right? Let's be clear about that. So they could easily get Kushner in, but they'd have to sacrifice Mike Pence. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump could say, I'd like to nominate Jared Kushner for the role of vice president. Now, maybe there's some nepotism laws. Maybe that can't happen. But this is the 21st century, and anything is possible. So Alex Jones has been pimping Kushner out as a potential presidential candidate. Keep that in mind. Just file that away. So we've got the Iran war rhetoric. It is heating up. Are people getting traumatized and triggered around that? Here comes their worst nightmare. Okay, here we go. Trump's going to take us to war. He's going to take us to war with Iran. Apparently, there is a rumor that he's going to go hit nuclear silos, nuclear sites that are preparing fissile material or whatever it is they're doing. That's possible. It's totally possible. But I would tend to think that there is a lot of cooperation going on because Iran is tight with Russia. They're very tight with Russia. And as much as Israel likes to bitch about Iran, they've got a relationship with Iran. There are a lot of really wealthy Israelis, and there's a big Jewish community, very wealthy in Iran. Now, maybe they could leave and evacuate, and all of a sudden things could get a lot easier, but I don't think that that's the case. I bet you they really like it there. I bet Iran is a pretty pleasant place to live, from the climate, get a lot of different foods there. Why would they want to leave? So would they sacrifice their own in a major war? I mean, look it up. There's a very large, very wealthy Jewish community that lives in Iran. Then you get into the mullahs, and the mullahs, of course, are very close to the Salafist and the Wahhabist side of Islam, which is more extremist. And the heart and soul and the center of Wahhabism is Saudi Arabia. It's Mecca. And we know that the Saudi Arabians and the Americans and the Israelis and the Zionists, they're all playing on the same team. They're all on the same team. So I think we have to take the Iran stuff with a real grain of salt. Like, don't buy into it too much. Don't allow it to get you all riled up and triggered. If it happens, if it's going to happen, then we're looking at a major economic downturn, quite possibly. Wall Street, even the algorithms don't like war unless it's a military-industrial complex company like McDonnell Douglas or Raytheon, in which case they could carry the market because their stock will shoot through the roof. Speaking of stocks, Facebook's stock took a huge dump, a major dump. Facebook has lost $15 billion. $15 billion. Mark Zuckerberg himself is worth $5 billion less today than he was 2 days ago. And that's because the quarterly earnings and the statistics on Facebook's growth are down by about 20%. And that trend does not look like it is going to reverse at any point in the near future. So there's huge amounts of money that have been invested in Facebook, and Facebook is kind of dying. With all the scandals around Facebook and all the privacy stuff and people getting off Facebook. And there's a whole group of young people that are just not into Facebook. Young people are into Instagram, which I think is owned by Facebook, right? So they're kind of hedging their bets. Instagram is probably going to be the new Facebook because young people just won't get off. It's boring for them. They don't want to sit there and read a bunch of words. They don't want to sit there and read a bunch of articles. They want to watch videos. They want to make a video. And that's it. Video, 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 image, video, video, image. That is your future of social media. It is not Facebook. So they're concerned. And the government, who has its crooked fingers and crooked pointy fingers in Facebook, should be concerned as well, because it is a major data gathering tool and has been since its inception. So if Facebook goes away or the numbers go down, there's just less information available at kind of a low-hanging fruit level, right? So don't let yourself get triggered by the Iran stuff. I'm not saying it can't happen. If it does happen, it could be a deal where Trump and the Iranians and the Israelis are working on kind of a plan where there could be a strike on something that doesn't mean anything. Like what happened in Syria, where supposedly they hit a plant that all these, I don't know, elites had some kind of shared interest in. So if something does happen, don't jump all over it. You don't want to jump all over it anyway. You know, we're in a point now where we have to retrain our entrainments so that everything that comes across the screen doesn't make our pulse jump, our breath stop, and our fingers go like this. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of a toolkit for you to stay cool, right? Now we also have a huge amount of material coming out on the pedophilia side with Hollywood. This is a big, big deal. It's a really big deal. Whether it makes headline news or whether it's a ripple effect, whether it's kind of a quasi QAnon sort of LARP, there are people now that are naming names in a big, big way. So just this last week, Sarah Ruth Ashcraft, ironically, her initials are SRA, which also stands for Satanic Ritual Abuse. She decided that she was going to break some news on her Twitter feed. And on her Twitter feed, she talks about Tom Hanks being somebody who molested her fairly consistently when she was young. She named some other names. A guy who played the voice of Jafar in Aladdin. And some other people. But Hanks he's the whale. He's the big fish. And she happens to be from Michigan, which I think is pretty interesting. And the reason why I think it's interesting is because if you look at Michigan, there's a pretty consistent history of mind control and MK Ultra, beta kit and programming. Kathy O'Brien is from Michigan. So is Sarah Ruth Ashcraft. You have the Michigan State scandal. Okay, Michigan. Michigan seems to be this kind of nest, this infestation. One of the great MK Ultra programmable kittens of all time, Madonna's from Michigan. Grew up near Ann Arbor. Not Michigan State, which is Lansing, but Ann Arbor. So, does Sarah Ruth Ashcraft have some credibility? Quite possibly. I mean, the Michigan thing kind of even lends itself to it. And we know that the Michigan State scandal with gymnastics, again, that's there. Interesting stuff, right? Now, her father has come out and taken a few swings against her and says she's troubled, she needs help, nothing ever. Oh, look, if you're a father your daughter comes out and you've tricked her out, and there's a huge amount at stake, then of course you would come out and take your own daughter on, right? You'd have to. Or maybe the people who were essentially crossing your palms for you pimping out your daughter, maybe they tell you got to go on the offensive, you got to denounce your daughter. But there's a possibility that the daughter is crazy and nuts and is trying to gain some popularity and attention. Look, we're in uncharted territory now. When Kathy O'Brien wrote her book, she was one of the few survivors of this very dark, dehumanizing programming. And she wrote a book. It was all pretty much pre-internet. Well, the internet was around, but Twitter was not a place to break stories at that time, which is what Sarah Ruth Ashcroft has done, or Ashcraft, the ashy craft. But what's interesting about Kathy O'Brien is that everything that she said in her book, and all the names that she's named, nobody has ever come after Kathy O'Brien, not to my knowledge. They don't want to sue her. They don't want to get into court with Kathy O'Brien. That would be complete and utter suicide for them. And they don't even want to address the book or address that they're in the book, because then they would have to answer a lot of questions about it. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this Sarah Ruth Ashcraft. Now, another person surfaced over the last 48 hours. It's a guy by the name of Isaac Kappy, Kappy. He's got about 19 shows and films under his belt. And one of his buddies in LA is Seth Green, the actor. And it was through Seth Green that Isaac Kappy began to become exposed to the pedophilia culture firsthand. And then he, through his latest videos on Periscope, which I would highly recommend, has gone out and named names in a really big way. I'm just going to pass on the names that he's named in his video. I don't have any proof as to whether or not these people are actual pedophiles, but he seems to. At the top of his list is Steven Spielberg. That doesn't surprise me, by the way. Doesn't surprise me. Also included in that list are Stephen Colbert. He says that Stephen Colbert and John Podesta are really good friends. Also in that list is Jimmy Kimmel. These are all people that have indulged in underage sex, and quite possibly even more. He names a number of different names. It's out there. It is out there, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. He also reaffirms Sarah Ruth Ashcraft's assertion that Tom Hanks is also part of the club. And why is this important? And why is it happening now? Well, of course, we're in the sign of Leo. We have a solar eclipse in Leo. Leo deals with children. I've been talking about the true node in Leo in the final degrees, which puts it in the first decan of Leo. So a lot of the child stuff is coming to the surface, whether it's kids in a cave in Thailand, or kids on the border of Mexico and Arizona and California and Texas, or kids being molested and having their minds broken in situations of ritual abuse, which occurs in all corridors of power, not just Hollywood. We're in it now. We're in these final few days of the true node in Leo, and we are going to get more and more information about kids, more and more emotional currency about kids. And then the South Node in Aquarius, which is the Achilles heel, and that's all about media, social media, the media itself, film, and to some extent television. All falls under the rubric of Aquarius. Film used to be mostly a 12th house deal, a Piscean deal, because of how you would view film. You would actually go to a theater, again, one of those places that a lot of people don't go to, right? You go to a theater, it's dark, you're dealing with celluloid. Celluloid is a congealed liquid, and light is shown through the celluloid so that you can get images. Celluloid as a liquid is very much connected to you. Like if you get into the actual production of film, which they don't even really do anymore, you're dealing with things like fossil fuels, plastics, resins that come out of the whole fossil fuel, petroleum-based substance, foundation formation. So there's that connection. But film, and to much larger extent, video has moved into Aquarius and the 11th house. So when people actually watch films now, they watch them at home. A lot of films are watched at home, even though they're first-run movies, through things like torrents and Pirate Bay. When Pirate Bay was around, you could actually grab movies, first-run movies. You don't have to go to the theater; they're still out there. You can watch them at home. That's an Aquarian experience. That's an 11th house experience. You're going into a website, even if it's a dark website, you're grabbing content, you're bringing it home, and you're watching it. And even if it's not to that extent, there are a number of streaming services that have film. They're all digital. And you watch them in your home. It's no longer really a 12th house thing. So I'm just giving you this comparison because that's the South Node in Aquarius. Now we're seeing the Achilles heel of these people that are driving the industry and driving the medium. And look at Aquarians. Aquarians are going to take a hit. Oprah Winfrey is an Aquarian, and I think she's taking hits. Who else? Ellen is an Aquarian. Keep your eye on the whole Ellen thing, or what's going on with her. Is Spielberg an Aquarius? Let me just look up Spielberg here really quickly. Just want to make sure. I don't want to. I always thought he was an Aquarius, but I haven't spent much time with this chart. Let's see what we got here. Sagittarius. And Mr. Tom Hanks happens to be a Cancer. Interesting. July 9th. That's around what? So we got 9, and then it's around 17, 18 degrees Cancer. So he's going to have Saturn opposing his sun next year. I wonder if Hanks will retire from acting with that Saturn-Sun opposition. Pluto's been opposing the sun lately, too. Oh, boy. Interesting times. So, listen, we are here and we're in it, right? So we've got the pedophile stuff, Hollywood stuff, exploding. That'll trigger a lot of people. We have, Iran, aggression talk, and then there's always some three-ring circus going on around Trump. We've got the NXIVM stuff, which is starting to bubble beneath the surface as well with the arrest of Claire Bronfman. Well, that'll be interesting. I don't think Bronfman will do any time. She's too well connected. She has way too much money through her family, even though she's squandered hundreds of millions, if not close to $1 billion, investing in Keith Raniere and NXIVM. I was having a discussion with somebody over on Facebook. It was like part of one of the Facebook threads, and they said, "What power did Keith Raniere have to get all these people to buy into him? Was he hung like a horse?" That was the question. Oh, maybe he was. Who knows? He certainly had zero charisma. When you listen to him and you hear him and watch him talk, he's about as charismatic as my patio chair out here. I think my patio chair might have more charisma, to be quite honest with you. So we've got the NXIVM stuff happening, and there will be an intersection. There will be an interstitial connection between NXIVM and the pedophilia stuff and the trafficking stuff. It will come together. That's going to be the bridge that makes a connection between a number of different worlds. But I was having another conversation today, and the people that are involved in that circle of trafficking and power, they'll basically self-detonate as much as they can before the truth comes out. Because these people also run other venues inside the media, news venues, right? Radio, TV, they're also involved in the economy at super high levels. We're talking banking interest, Europe, old money, names like Rothschild, Goldschmidt, you know the players. And they'll burn the whole shit house down before they're taken out. So as we approach this event horizon with the children and pedophilia and the currency, people have to be very aware that there is a huge amount at stake and at risk. And the people that are running those programs will hit the self-destruct button before they are allowed to come before the public, have to answer to the public, have to go to trial, do any time. This is a network and this is a system that has been in place for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of years. And they're not going to do a purple walk around it. They're just not. So you could expect the economy going down. I mean, I'm just giving you scenarios so that you can kind of look ahead and see what's the potential of what can happen. And I'm not saying don't go down this path. I think it's a good thing to go down this path because, and I've said this for a long time, you go down that rabbit hole and everything gets exposed. Pretty much. There are a few things that may not be, but that is a major clear cut. Major. But don't expect it to just kind of go along and be some kind of, kumbaya experience. These people will fight back. And they'll fight back at a much larger level. They'll fight back economically. If they have to, they'll start a war. Whatever it is, they will burn the place down before anything happens to them. So, that said, it is still important. It's important because if they burn the whole place down, guess what? We get to rebuild it again. And maybe they're not a part of it. And it would be great. It's a nasty, vile, evil virus that's been on this planet for centuries. And it goes from world to world to world to world. Devouring innocence. That's what it does. It devours innocence. And then once it devours and deflowers innocence, it has its networks and its agents and its operatives, its proxies that are running the program. They're running the program, they're running the script, and they're running that level of consciousness. So it's like a viral infection. And we're coming to the end of that process here. It is happening. You are witness to history, to be quite honest with you. And I'm not being hyperbolic at all. And there's a lot of positivity, a lot of rebirth that can come out of this. But it's going to be a rocky ride. We're shooting some rapids here. And astrologically, of course, we're in the eclipse. Now, at the last eclipse, which happened 2 weeks ago, I talked about with Heather Eland, I talked about this interesting Star of David pattern that was in the sky during the eclipse. And then, of course, I talked about this in the 1,948 years since the blowing of the shofar on July 12th, 70 AD, which marked the beginning of the fall of the Second Temple. What happened just 5 days after that? Well, there was a vote in the Knesset. Israel passed it, which basically turned Israel into a nationalistic state, meaning that if they were going to have any kind of action against the Palestinians or any other group, that would not be in conflict with their directive. And their directive was to maintain their religious and cultural authority and identity at any cost. So what they did is they kind of re-upped their version of who they are. And that happened 5 days after we started to talk about this on the show or on the stream. And it happened. So what's going to happen next? Where are we now? This eclipse is a lot trickier than the last eclipse. And we're having these war drums that are, boom, 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 boom. That's happening. We've got the pedophilia stuff happening, right? Is anything going to happen today? Maybe. Question mark. But remember, the eclipse energy, it's about a week and a half after and a week and a half before. So a lot of this stuff that came out around Sarah Ruth Ashcraft, around Isaac Cappy, and even more, that's in the shadow of the eclipse. We're coming into Mercury retrograde. That's going to be very interesting as well. People are going to recant or try to revise their statements, rebuild their images. It's going to be very interesting. You might see people who were very tight with other people split off and disavow them. And I didn't even talk about the James Gunn stuff or the Michael Ian Black stuff or the Patton Oswalt stuff or the Sarah Silverman stuff. This is very, very, very important material. Not just because they're deviant or those things, although those things are kind of important too, right? But one of the things that they claim, they being people like Michael Ian Black and Patton Oswalt and Sarah Silverman, it's that in comedy, you're supposed to be able to go after a sacred cow. For a long time, the sacred cows were ethnic jokes. You hear the one about the Polak. You hear one about the Mick. You hear the one about the Spick. You hear the one about the Jew. I mean, that was like, those were the sacred cows. And then, they kind of went away. Then the sacred cows became, in comedy itself, being able to use profanity. Saying a word like fuck, which is what Lenny Bruce went through. Lenny Bruce was funny. He was more cerebral than he was funny. But, he's always the person. He's the comic that died for everybody's sins, right? For freedom of speech. But there was that line, and he got to that line. And that line was the verboten, right? The verboten. The line, the comedic line, is where the sacred and the profane kind of collide into one another. And that line has just been kept getting moved and moved and moved and moved and moved. And Michael Ian Black was citing that he is a comedian in the same vein as Bill Hicks. Well, he's not even close to Bill Hicks. Bill Hicks, Alex Jones, whoever the guy was. He's not even close. And Bill Hicks had bad nights. He had bad comedic nights. Other nights, Bill Hicks was a freaking genius and brilliant. But Bill Hicks always took it up another level, right? If you look at his chart, Hicks is a Sagittarius. He'd done psychedelics. I mean, he was always about trying to get to this next level of consciousness. There's nothing in those tweets about hanging out with your naked kid, or there's nothing in that realm of the profane that even gets close to taking it up to the next level of consciousness. It's kind of like, how would these guys feel? How would the left feel? Not in the left-right paradigm here, but how would they feel if all of a sudden people had all kinds of crazy jokes about the Holocaust? Oh, I was just joking around. Oh, I was just joking. Oh, yeah, I've got about 3,000 tweets about the good times at Buchenwald. But I was just joking around. How do you think the left would feel about that? Psst. That person never work again. Never. Ever, ever, ever. But they keep moving this line. They keep moving the line, and it is the line where the sacred and the profane, right? It's that line. And kids, in a lot of ways, they're not angels. They're not perfect. Sometimes they can be total shits. But they are in kind of the realm of the sacred, right? We are here to protect their development, theoretically. And what have they done is they've run a desecration program and turned a domain that is sacred into something that is utterly profane and disgusting. In the name of shock and getting out as far onto the edge as you can with comedy, that being their raison d'etre, but it's completely flawed, and they've taken a step too far. And if I was somebody in Hollywood, if I was a comedian or an actor, or even if I was like a second or third level grip, and I had a Twitter account and I had anything related to kids, I'd be in there, I'd be scrubbing it like crazy. So this is where we are on this eclipse. It's fascinating, really, really fascinating. But I did get a sense of the energy, which would be more fixed this time around. So whatever happens from now until 10 days from now, so like the middle part of August, just keep your eyes on what's happening, what's taking place. Because there is a really strong possibility that something comes out of this that is kind of irrevocable, and that we have to deal with the results of that, whatever they are. In the meantime, we're in the sign of Leo. It's a good time to get out and have a vacation, play, have some fun, relax, lighten up. The world is a heavy place. You don't have to stick your head in the sand, but it also helps to de-stress and play with things a little bit. Well, I think that's a good little segue here to get into this discussion with Steve and Krys. Now, remember, this is a first in a series, sort of trialogue on the life of John Dee and the alchemical and hermetic influence of John Dee throughout Western Europe, then ultimately to the United States and the esoteric roots of the United States. So we're going to do more of this. We're going to stretch this out. This is a kind of a quick introduction and breakdown of Dee and his origins. So let's get into this right now with my good friends from Logosophiya. Let me plop this in here. The file all loaded up, ready to go. Hold on a second. Hold on. Come on now. Oh. It's not allowing me to grab. There we go. There we go. So I'm going to stop the recording for the YouTube side of things, and I'll be back and give that a wrap. And then I actually did a video for Steve and Krys and myself, and that'll be on YouTube as a separate offering. Just go ahead and watch that, and you'll be able to see that and listen to it on the podcast as well. So I'll be back in about 36 minutes, and I'll do an outro and a wrap. In the meantime, let's get into the first great magus, also known as... So we're back again at the end of the month, the final Friday, with my good friends, Steve and Krys, down in North Carolina. Welcome back to the show. Today we got an interesting little appetizer. We got a bit of a brief run today, just to kind of whet people's appetite a little bit. And we're going to be talking about John Dee, who is considered one of the great maguses of, well, perhaps history. And you guys have developed kind of a fascination and an interest in Dee's work lately. And you brought the idea to bring Dee to the sort of the show and get into it. And let's do it. Thanks for coming on, Steve and Krys.
Good to see you, Robert. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity, as always, to come and chat with your audience, your wonderful audience. So we appreciate that. Yeah, I'm going to just quickly, so I guess what we'd like to do, because this is probably something that's going to run at least a couple of shows, and we'll do a sort of a quick intro. Okay. What we want to do is, because we were sort of in this place of just, complete negativity and just everything spiritual has been turned on its head. It's kind of like what we wanted to do last week with Nicholas Roerich. We're interested in what is was there a sort of esoteric and spiritual beginning to America? Was there some sort of spiritual intent for what happened here? And I think that's really important to do. And maybe it's good to be starting this on the eclipse when maybe we can eclipse some of the old, negative being paradigm and start, finding out our origins and maybe our sacred origins. And that's kind of what I've been liking to do with the history of Western civilization and Western philosophy. But we can do this specifically with America. And so Krys will give you a quick update of how we kind of, got caught up into this sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess, we've been introduced to this quite some time ago, and kind of in the course of our amblings and inquiries into spiritual practice. And so we would sort of amble in and out of Western and Eastern philosophies. And I did take some classes on alchemy here in Asheville. I was very fortunate to study with Vincent Wren, and he's a real traditionalist when it comes to learning the spagyrics and the background and what have you. So I was familiar with John Dee's name and some of his work, but fortunately, Randy Morgans was doing an interview with Jason Louv, I guess it was about a month ago, and we clicked into it and thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I would highly recommend it. Anyone who wants to have some kind of background on what's going on here, go ahead and check on Randy's show that day.
Off Planet Radio.
Off Planet Media, I guess it is. And then as he was interviewing Jason Louv, who has just written a book called John Dee and the Empire of Angels, he got into a lot of the background, and then he gave a wonderful story about how, as he's doing all this research and all these studies on John Dee, he lived in an apartment complex, and he had been there for quite some time. And just by happenstance, got into a conversation with his neighbor across the hall, who had been living there for a while as well. And he said, "Oh, what are you up to? And what are you up to?" And, "Well, I do a lot of research on this guy named John Dee." And the guy says, "Really? So am I." So it turns out this is Alan Green, who's a Brit who lives in America, and I guess they're out in L.A. Mm-hmm. And so they got into this delicious conversation about their research. And they had both been in the apartment complex as neighbors for I don't know how many years, but years. So they got a big kick out of that, and then they exchanged stories and exchanged information. So we then started to pull the thread on Alan Green and went to his site and learned what he's up to. And then he's getting into how this steganography, not exsteganography, that's another show, but steganography, which is a form of cryptography that has the encryption out in the open, where it's there for all to see, but you have to have eyes to see it and background to recognize it. So he was doing that work on Shakespeare and making connections with Shakespeare and that whole stream. So then we went down that other rabbit hole. 26 minutes. And so that's what got us excited about this whole thing. So we picked up Jason Louv's book, started reading that, and that led us to think, well, maybe this would be something that we could share with the greater community. And I would highly recommend that people really go out and chase down that interview just to get some background. So when we go into it next month, they'll have some understanding of where it's coming from.
Okay. So you guys got turned on through the Randy Moggins piece, but there was always, there was already something sort of brewing because we were talking about Rourke, we're talking about Bacon, which leads us back to Dee. So let's just set the stage briefly. Maybe you want to jump in, Steve, and kind of give people sort of a snapshot of Dee and, where he came from and how he rose to prominence during the court of Queen Elizabeth I.
Well, yeah, I guess part of what I wanted to do was sort of a larger background of how of the philosophies that were impinging on Dee when he came to be. But I can say a few things first off the bat, that he was Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer. He was an alchemist. He spent the end of his life talking in discourse with angels through this person who was semi-disreputable named Edward Kelly, I guess the jury's still kind of out on him and how real that connection is, and I think that's what we hope to get into at some point. But Dee was the main mathematician of his time. He did the astrology for Queen Elizabeth's coronation date. He apparently he may or may not have done a little magic when the Spanish Armada came in. He may have done a little weather magic. It's kind of hard to say. But he was...
So I just want to jump in there.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point because every time Spain came to fight the English and approached with their great ships, the weather was just horrible.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And they were defeated even before they could, fire, a cannon shot or a broadside. And it was consistent. So, was he summoning, some weather magic? I mean, it's quite possible because you would think that at some point the odds would line up with the Spaniards and they'd actually get good weather to attack, and they never did.
Right. And in fact, this is why a lot of people think that Shakespeare's and then the other aspect of this is who was Shakespeare. That gets into that too, and what Dee's influence on that. But Dee is considered by most people the character of Prospero in Shakespeare's last play,
Midsummer Night's Dream, right?
No. Where'd I go? The Tempest.
The Tempest,
which is a magnificent play. But so the character of Prospero in The Tempest controls the weather, and in fact controls an air spirit, Ariel, and causes. And then when his the people who originally exiled him and stole his kingdom, he causes the weather to shipwreck them. So whoever Shakespeare is encoded that aspect of things into this last play, The Tempest. So it seems like that was one of his bags of tricks, and I don't have the dates of that offhand, but the thing with Dee is that he's just he's a person that got kind of written out of history in any sense, because and even in his own lifetime, because basically he spent at least the last third of his lifetime pretty much destitute at his house. And one of the things he also had was the largest, I believe, personal library in the world at that time. So whereas he had something like 5,000 volumes, the Oxford University would have like half that in their library. So he was obviously a polymath, is completely learned in a whole bunch of different areas. And it's funny, it's going a completely different direction than I had planned, but this is okay. So the question, one of the questions that we want to ask and explore is this whole notion of Rosicrucianism and America. And so Dee was hugely influential with some of these early things that were written, Rosicrucian tracts that were written in and around 16, 14, 15, and 16. And They were manifestos, in fact. And they were really interesting because, amongst other things, it was a complete salvo against the Pope. You know, they literally said the Pope is the Antichrist, and the Jesuits are evil, and not too different than what a fair number of people might be saying these days too. But so Dee's and Francis Bacon comes into this too, but their influence comes in to these Rosicrucian manifestos. And the odd thing, though, is that really no one has come up. No, there are no there's no real evidence of an actual Rosicrucian group until much later. So the question is, the manifestos were written anonymously, though at least one of them, the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, is fairly well attributed to someone. The question is, what it seems like the fact of the manifestos might have created Rosicrucianism, because people were flipping out in Europe. There were a lot of people who were into alchemy, into astrology, into all these things, and they had to do it fairly much underground, especially after Queen Elizabeth died. Now, Queen Elizabeth was allowed Dee to do his thing, even though it was kind of against a lot of church dictates. She kind of let him do his thing and fostered a fair amount of alchemy within her kingdom, especially since it abetted her in times of war, apparently. But when her successor James I hits the throne in 1604, I'm not absolutely sure, but sometime around that time, King James is much more of a Puritan and very much against alchemy, and his fortune seemed to slip at that time. And also, the movements on continental Europe, inspired by these Rosicrucian manifestos, all these people would just come out of the woodwork and say, "Where are these people? They have some kind of wisdom. We want to know what it is. We want to join their group," but no one is able to find anybody. And then soon after that, by 1620, when actually King James's daughter and her husband, Prince Frederick, they were sort of like the golden couple, and they were really interested in alchemy, and they wanted to reestablish really the alchemical base in Prague, which is a place where Dee went back and forth a number of times earlier in his lifetime. But just after that, they really wanted to establish, this kingdom, this alchemical kingdom. And what happened was she was expecting her father, King James of England, to help her in this, and he abandoned her, and they got squashed and basically spent the rest of their lives with their court in exile in The Hague, in the Netherlands. So there was a squashing there of the alchemical movement, and it seems that there was a movement also at that time to start this sort of thing in America, and by certain people, including Dee and possibly Bacon, to make America this sort of place. Now, Dee had all sorts of things about Northwest Passage in America, and he comes up with what the did you want to say something about it?
I was just remembering, and Sir Walter Raleigh comes into play, doesn't he?
So there were a number of esoteric groups in England, which had to be esoteric, but there was this seems to be this movement that they wanted to make America because it was seen as this, blank slate, even though the natives apparently didn't. But for a lot of the English, and this is one of the things that Dee tried to convince Queen Elizabeth of, that this is the direction that they should go. So there are some things in America that point to this, and the most notable one is the tower in Newport. So, and the Newport Tower is easy to find pictures of. and it's also called Dee's Tower because apparently John Dee designed it. And there is a line, a really interesting line that runs from the Michael Ley line in England. The Michael Ley line is sometimes called the Dragon Line in England. I don't want to get too far afield, but most of the main Druidic and then following that church sites are along this line going out from Cornwall, and it points right to the United States, and it happens to cross this tower.
Very close. We're very close to the tower. Yeah.
So there seems to be something about the placement of the tower, and then there are certain like holes in the design of the tower that work through certain alignments, as all the stone monuments do, work with usually solstices and equinoxes, and the light falls in certain places. So there is something that was built, and it's still kind of mysterious as to when and who built the tower. Originally, it was thought that it was done by the Vikings, but it seems like it was an early trip, maybe in the 1560s, to the United States when this tower was built in this particular place. So there are artifacts, and then there are also people. For example, John Winthrop the Younger, who basically was the governor of Connecticut, who wanted to establish New London as a new alchemical city. And then you have other groups in Pennsylvania, probably not too far from where you were, I think in Bucks County, that established these monasteries based on Rosicrucian principles. So there's a lot there to play with. I'm trying to cram things in. There you go.
Good, there's the tower.
So there are all sorts of movements with the windows. I don't know if there was originally a roof to it. I think it's 8. I think it has 8 apertures. And I also have to stress that this is basically we're in progress in unearthing these things. That's why we kind of just wanted to introduce it today and just talk a little bit about it. And Krys is the one who's been reading the book on Dee. I don't know if you have some more to add.
Yeah, I could actually.
Krys, what I'd be really interested in, maybe you could shed some light on this, is how does he rise to prominence in the court?
It was not easy. I'm not exactly sure how the initial entree was into the court, but the competition was so fierce. There were many astrologers at the time who were doing the same kind of work as he was, but somehow he seemed to gain the favor of Queen Elizabeth.
I think he knew her before she was queen.
Yeah, quite possibly. But there was a lot of vindictiveness against him. He had actually gone to Cambridge and was educated there and got into some shenanigans. There's a story that I can't quite remember exactly how it went, and I'll have that for the next time we talk. But, also he was thrown into prison in the Tower of London and tortured in his younger days. So it was not an easy entree, and it was a bumpy ride. And he could never quite win enough favor with the Queen to get some kind of a stipend that he could depend upon. That's why he was always in some kind of a financial distress. So he would go back and forth to the continent to try to get some kind of patronage for his work and then come back again to England. So yes, he did have the ear of the Queen, but it seems like it wasn't always just him, that there were others who were really in fierce competition with him. So
I think, and Bacon's another one who was also relatively poor too.
Was he?
And also spent some time in the Tower. I guess everyone had to pay their dues, spend some time in the Tower during that time.
But even with his poverty-stricken financial system, he still managed to have this tremendous collection of books. So it seems like any extra money that he ever could get his hands on went into his inner work. Mm-hmm. And he really building his internal economics rather than external. And that was where his focus was more important to him.
Do you think Queen Elizabeth I was a man?
I had never thought of it. I don't know. I have no idea.
That's actually kind of a fairly popular rumor.
Yeah.
Is that so?
Yeah, but I heard that one, and I've also heard that Bacon is her illegitimate son.
Mm-hmm.
That's another one of the rumors. You know.
Yeah, I'm open. You know.
Somehow it doesn't ring for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
How would I know?
And you know, geez, all those Elizabeths live quite the long life.
Mm-hmm.
There's like two of them, I guess.
I mean, just from a standpoint that if she was actually a man, and Bacon knew clearly, he would have an inside track on
right
court astrologer. I don't know whether she is or not, but it's been tossed around at that.
Yeah, and there were also so many, you know, rumors about her affairs with various people whose names I don't recall offhand.
Well, she had an affair with, wasn't it? Was it Sir Walter Raleigh, right?
Did she?
Well, and I heard she had a favorite, Robert something or another. Now I can't remember the last name.
Yeah. So in the movie Elizabeth, which is actually a pretty good movie.
Yep.
She has an affair with Raleigh. She sends him to America, and
that would be worth watching again.
Yeah, well, and Raleigh, of course, is another one involved, and he also had one of these, you know, secret esoteric groups. There were a number of them. And there's another one by Sir Philip Sidney that Giordano Bruno figures heavily within, and Giordano Bruno and John Dee were kind of in the same ballpark as astrologers and magi, because Giordano Bruno is really interesting. He gets burned at the stake by the Catholic Church, pretty much within nose shot of Galileo, which is why Galileo recanted his findings of the Earth revolving around the sun. You know, he certified Copernicus's work.
Right.
But Giordano Bruno is another one, and he was actually in London for a long time. I don't know about his relationships with John Dee, but they seem to be cut from the same cloth. And maybe at some point I go to the antecedents of that, but the thing that runs through them very strongly is this understanding of nature. So it's like a what's called a pantheism, I guess.
Right.
Everything in nature is alive and
spirit.
Divine.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're going to do magic, you have to have that as sort of a background, you know, for anything. So, and this is why, of course, the Catholic Church did not like that because they were loved to enforce that strict separation between God and the world, which comes out of Thomas Aquinas to a great deal in the 1200s. So they loved that strict separation because otherwise you wouldn't need them to get to God. If God was everywhere, who the hell needs a church, right? Mm-hmm. You know, most of us probably feel that way.
Right. They wanted to stay in control of their form of magic.
That's their so it's always the opposing forms of magic, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the dark magic of control.
It tends to be sort of a dynamic between Saturn and Uranus.
Yeah.
Not Saturn and Jupiter, but Saturn and Uranus. You know, the classic battle between Uranus and Kronos, right?
Right. The father and the son.
Yeah.
You know.
So the roots really of Dee's Hermetic philosophy and a lot of the ideas that were kind of spreading in the underground intellectual circles in Europe at that time could be attributed to like Enochian magic, right? What do you think?
Well, yeah, though. Well, you were going to answer that.
What?
Do you want to answer that?
I'm sorry.
I'm
sorry. I was distracted by Jasper. Would you repeat the question?
So
please?
About Enochian magic.
What do you want to know?
Well, we were talking. Steve and I were tossing around this idea that the ideas that were becoming popular in Europe in an underground sort of way, right, with the mystics and the alchemists, that the source material for that was Enochian magic.
Okay, so that's the language of the angels,
right?
And that comes in with before Edward Kelly, but that really clicked in when he and Edward Kelly hooked up.
But Dee never called it that.
Okay.
Right. I'm just throwing that in.
That came later. The actual term came later, but it was the Enochian language of the angels, and you're right. He never called it that. But this character, Edward Kelly, shows up, and they're doing all this incredible work, and he was a pretty powerful, maybe a little bit on the dark side.
Well, so the rumor is that Kelly's a summoner, right?
Yeah.
And that's what separated him from Dee. Like Dee was kind of this elemental sort of magician. He could play with things like sulfur and he'd do tricks and, maybe get into a little weather magic. But Kelly brought the summoning magic. And
it seems like it was within the first 15 minutes of their getting, into their work together that, the angel came in. And then there's this whole thing with the demonic angel that comes in.
We're doing circle work. I mean, that's what Kelly is bringing to John Dee's life is circle work.
Yeah.
And that comes out of that whole, it's sort of Enochian, but also the Babylonian tradition. And this is where King Solomon was sort of not just the king and the ruler and the emperor, but he was a magician. Solomon was a summoner. Mm-hmm. And that's where he got the majority of his power. So this is a Babylonian sort of technique that was, it wasn't popularized, but clearly was used to gain access and information. It was the dark web before the dark web was the dark web.
It really was. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then they were getting messages from the angels, actually very specific instructions on how to build their sacred table to do their work with. Yes. And it had very specific dimensions. It was a cube-like piece of furniture, and then it had all the sigils around the outside and sigils on top, and they would do their work and do this very devout praying before they went into their work and summon the angels. And then this whole language was coming through.
Right.
And it was apparently a language that, had syntax and grammar, and it was very highly structured as a language, an independently existing language, not independently existing, but independent of other systems.
Right.
And it had its own structure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It had its own integrity as a language.
Well, that's when, so when Kelly shows up, that's when Dee really changes his game.
Very much so.
And I'm not sure if it's for the better, right? Because it seems like, and you could correct me, but it seems like after the Kelly thing sort of collapses, John Dee's life starts to take a bit of a turn for the worse. And he starts to go into this kind of darker period and begins to experience things like destitution and trying to find another court and all that stuff, right? I think it's on the back end of the Kelly meeting. Yeah. Is that what you found?
Well, they traveled to Prague together also, and tried to, Rudolph II, who was in Prague, I think. So they went that route. They went to various places in Europe, apparently Poland too. There were certain princes who were supporting that kind of work and interested in magic and what they were bringing. But that's something that we're going to, so we haven't fully delved into that. So I can't be too specific about what was going on. But the general feeling is, there's a lot of questions about it, certainly. Yeah,
he certainly has to go, hat in hand to the continent looking for financial help just to support his life.
Yeah.
And apparently Kelly spent every penny they had in brothels and what have you. He had lost his ears because he was caught counterfeiting. So it was kind of I just want to connect briefly to Dee's predecessor, someone known by the name of Paracelsus.
Yeah, I was going to bring Paracelsus up.
Right. So Paracelsus was Swiss. His actual name, Theophrastus von Hohenheim. So Paracelsus is easier, but he's kind of like a generation before Dee, and he's an alchemist. And a couple of things I found really interesting about him, and I was going to do a couple of quotes, and there's a couple of things that he was trained in mining, and you find this coming up over and over again. And also when I talked about John Winthrop, he was also John Winthrop Jr. and his esoteric Connecticut. He was also involved in mining, and this sort of metallurgy as a sacred art seems to show up in the background a lot of things, and you can even trace it back to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a tin miner, and there are supposed extra biblical tales of him bringing the Christ on his trips as a young man during the so-called lost years to Glastonbury and to England to work with the mining. So that's one thing. But one of the things that Paracelsus realized, that he couldn't get the real education from the university. He said the high colleges managed to produce high asses. And he said you have to learn from old wives, gypsies, sorcerers, wanderers, dervishes, and outlaws. So that also connects back to this sort of Edward Kelly and this, this sort of outlier.
Well, so we're talking about the left-handed path here is really what we're
and it's
unpack.
And it's and the left-handed path is the most dangerous. It is the most the most
lead to obliteration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Paracelsus went all the way to Turkey, looking for wisdom, and throughout the Egypt and Arabia, and picking up what he could from dervishes and what have you. And again, he's back with the healing with Natura. He was taught by
the goddess Natura.
Yeah, the goddess Natura, which I was going to try to get into. The goddess Natura shows up in the school of Chartres. So there is a sort of feminine aspect to this. But one of the other things is, but he was also a great healer. And he was taught by Trithemius, who was also a big influence on John Dee.
Who was a German teacher.
And also one of the things that he was interested in was discoursing with angels. And you can maybe want to talk. And he did this process of making plant essences, and he used dew. And maybe this is kind of a good place to end up, because I know we don't have a lot of time, or we can at least wind up. So I found this really interesting in Frances Yates' books. And Frances Yates was this woman who died, I think, in the mid-'70s or something. But she's kind of like the main scholar of Elizabethan times, Elizabethan magic, Rosicrucianism, things like that. But what Paracelsus did, and he would actually put like glass plates out overnight and collect the dew off of them. And the dew was imbued with the overnight and with the qualities of the sky and who knows what else.
And then you would take the plant material and then you would burn it down, and you would have the ash of the plant material. You would mix it with the dew, and then you would reconstruct it. And so they have that whole, dissolution and then coagulation, which is the big alchemical process. And then the resulting product is called a spagyric. And a spagyric could be loosely associated with tincture. It's a medication. You could say it's like a cross between homeopathy and tincture, but it contains the plant essence and spirit in a very different quality. So when you ingest it, it's giving like the life force and the real essence of the plant, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. But that's called a spagyric.
Well, this is some good source material, some good background on Dee. And the next time we get together, we'll really stretch out and kind of explore his influence with the court and some of his influence on the founding of America. So I'm looking forward to that next one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
we'll
did
see.
find one little tidbit about his astrology. There is no official record of John Dee's birth date and location, but his own diaries tell us that he was born in the city of London, and that it was on July 13th, just past, 1527, and it was 4:02 p.m.
Yeah, I saw that. We'll throw that chart up next time.
Yeah, it might
That
be
would be
interesting.
interesting
I think
to
it'd be
do.
interesting.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is he had Pluto and Capricorn in his chart. And it's at 21 degrees, and we're approaching Pluto and Capricorn at 21 degrees.
Oh,
Is that
So maybe that's why there's some John Dee
resonance going on?
going around right now. So
Well, that's interesting.
yeah. So
All right.
good.
So that's a good
yeah.
jump in the lake there.
Yeah. So maybe we'll solve the question.
Actually, his place was called Mort Lake.
Yes, right. His home was called Mort Lake, Death Lake.
Mort Lake, Death Lake. Well, Steve and Krys, it's been great to have you back on again. LogosophiaBooks.com, right? Or Logosophia. I always get this mixed up.
Books.
Yeah. LogosophiaBooks.com.
And you can find their material there, all the books that they produce, including Steve's book, which is fantastic, Catabatic Wind. And he's going to go get a book.
Oh, he's going to go and show you.
There it is.
There it is, Diana.
That's a really great book.
Yeah, and here's the John Dee book.
John Dee Angels. Hey, listen, gotta go.
All right.
Okay.
Wish
See you in a
everybody.
month.
All
Take
right.
care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Great.
Well, that was Steve and Krys Crimi. And let me activate the outro here for our YouTube transmission. So, Steve and Krys Crimi, and sort of the first part, the bedrock for the John Dee Experience. That'd be a good name for a band, wouldn't it? The John Dee Experience. These have names like that for bands. The John Butcher Axis. Pretty good band, actually. John Butcher Axis. The John Dee Experience, also known as the JDE. For a lot of you out there who know that Jasper is kind of an integral part of my show, he wasn't feeling real well for a few days. And still is a bit under the weather, but he's coming back. So all the loving thoughts and the prayers for Mr. Jasper are really grateful for them. I think they might have helped. Look at that. He's even kind of nibbling me. Isn't that right, Jasper? So in the interim, as the interview was taking place, I was just scanning for some headlines. And one of the headlines I just ran across was the fact that apparently Israel has now closed the gates of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, of course, going to be the site of the Third Temple, or would be the site of the Third Temple. Because apparently there is some heavy-duty action going on with Muslims who are praying at the mosque, and apparently there's some friction. I don't know exactly what the friction is, but it's enough to actually close the gates of the mosque. This is kind of significant. Keep your eye on that mosque. Al-Aqsa, the Third Temple, this is where the action is and will be happening for the next few weeks, the next few months, and into next year as we race up to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020. I want to thank everybody for joining me today on the Friday FARcast. We're going to get back into the 15 Minutes of Flame broadcast here in August. So I'm actually going to be making a return to the airwaves every single day. If you like these broadcasts, well, continue to listen. I'll be on the Sunday night stream, the YouTube 11th House live stream. That's where we get into astrology. It's a lot of fun. Last week we might have had a little too much fun, but we'll see what happens in the aftermath of this eclipse. In the meantime, I really want to thank Steve and Krys Crimi, as always. And I think next week, Wendy Morrison and I are going to be looking at the possibility that JFK Jr. didn't die and might indeed actually be QAnon. We'll be looking at that from an astrological perspective, as Wendy seems to have some astrological chops along with a number of other things. So you may want to look forward to that exchange between Wendy and I, which I think we're gonna tape that this weekend. So check in on that for the Friday FARcast next Friday. In the meantime, you know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open to what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Have a great eclipse and have a great weekend.